Today we're going to have an overview of malaria and babesia. Now, malaria has been recognized for a long time as a disease, mainly because the fever pattern, along with an enlarged spleen, sort of indicated that this was a disease different from other diseases. And so it's been recorded um, throughout history. The Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans, etc., been able to recognize malaria. These are the learning objectives for today. And we're coming down this route. So parasitic protozoans, the apicomplexa, we already covered the coccidians. And now we're going to look at Plasmodium and Babesia. And today I'm going to talk about just the general biology and epidemiology of these diseases. And Dr. Gosnell is going to talk about the pathology on Friday. Now, as far as human malaria goes, we have Plasmodium falciparum, vivax, ovale, malariae, and Plasmodium knowlesi. So you won't be required to know knowlesi, but it's a monkey malaria that has been causing a significant number of infections in Southeast Asia. But it's not yet a worldwide problem. Now, the life cycle involves the mosquito, and the mosquito is going to ingest gametocytes, and there's a female and a male gametocyte. It gets taken up with a blood meal by the mosquito. The male, or microgamete, exflagellates, and each one of these organisms will break off and fertilize a macrogamete, which then would become a zygote that differentiates in an ookinete, which penetrates the gut lining of the mosquito and ends up as an oocyst on the exterior surface of the intestinal tract. Within the oocyst, then sporozoites form, and the sporozoites break out of these oocysts and then migrate to the salivary glands of the mosquito, so that the next time they bite a person, these sporozoites are injected into the skin. So they will spend a short amount of time in the skin, and then they have to use the bloodstream to get to the liver. And the only cell that they can infect is a hepatic cell. Now, within the hepatic cell, they will go through asexual division, eventually producing many merozoites. So this liver cell will break open. The cells released are called merozoites. These merozoites can only invade red blood cells. So they're going to invade red blood cells. And again, they're going to divide by asexual division, eventually producing a cell full of merozoites. So this will rupture. Merozoites will invade new cells and start the cycle over again. So you can see that this cycle is going to result in a lot of destruction of the red blood cells. So anemia is a common cause of all the malaria species. Some of these merozoites will form male and female gametes to complete the life cycle. So the only mosquito that can transmit malaria to humans is the Anopheles mosquito. And there's many different species of Anopheles mosquitoes. The most proficient at transmitting malaria is Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles phanensis, which you can see is the predominant species in Africa. And this is one of the reasons why malaria has been so hard to control in Africa, is because these two species are very efficient vectors of human malaria. In the rest of the world, these species of Anopheles, given a choice, they'll bite animals over people. So in some ways, it's a little bit easier to control. but you can see that the Anopheline mosquito is found throughout the world. It stops right around here in the Pacific, with no Anopheline mosquitoes found east of that point, including Hawaii. So we don't have Anopheline mosquitoes in Hawaii. So therefore, we don't get any transmission of malaria. So Plasmodium falciparum is in red because it's the most lethal form, and that's the one the physician wants to know, does my patient have this or not, because it can very quickly overwhelm the patient and result in a severe anemia and other complications. Malaria is a lot less common, found in mostly tropical areas of the world. Ovale, found primarily in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Plasmodium vivax is found worldwide, except in Africa, so you don't see much vivax in Africa. It's fairly rare in Africa. And as we said, Plasmodium knowlesi is in Southeast Asia. So this is a breakdown of the species by geographical area. So if you look at Africa, almost 90% of all infections worldwide are Plasmodium falciparum. And then the next most common one is Ovale, with very little vivax and malariae. Versus the Middle East, or for example, Southeast Asia, you have falciparum is less common, with Plasmodium vivax being much more common in these areas. And that's true also in Asia. Yeah, so between Plasmodium falciparum and vivax, you get almost 90+% of all infections worldwide are due to those two, with lesser numbers occurring with the other species. Now, the spleen plays a pretty big role in the control of malaria, and if you don't have a spleen, your body really has no way of clearing the infection. So normally the spleen functions to remove old blood cells, red blood cells, from your circulation. It has a regulatory role in controlling the volume of red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. So it can be a reservoir for red blood cells, for example. And it's important in the immune response to blood pathogens. Now, in malaria, the spleen is responsible for removing infected red blood cells, the byproduct of the digestion of hemoglobin, which is hemozoin, and any other cellular debris released by the lysine parasites. And it also sequesters RBCs. And it's part of our, immune response. And it does this by filtering the blood through these stave cells. And if the infected cell can't squeeze through these small openings, then they'll get filtered out and destroyed. Now, the enlarged spleen is so characteristic of malaria that epidemiologists use it to characterize an area because it's easier to palpate the spleen than to do blood films. And so a holoendemic area is an area that has intense transmission all year round, and the spleen rate in children less than 5 years old, and so the spleen rate is just the percentage of children that have enlarged spleens is over 75%. And so this is most of sub-Saharan Africa fall into this holoendemic definition. So malaria is a disease of poor countries just because the richer countries were able to eradicate it. And the poorer countries, they don't have enough money to have a full-scale malaria control program. So this map kind of gives you an idea of the fact that sub-Saharan Africa and India, parts of Southeast Asia, still malaria has a huge impact on their population. So WHO is very proud of this graph. So the red bars are indicating the number of the number of cases in Africa, right? So you can see Africa by far has the highest number of cases across all years. But what they're proud of is that they're able to reduce the number of deaths so that if this number keeps falling, they're considering their efforts a success. But you can see the actual number of cases is declining very slowly, but the number of deaths is declined much more rapidly. Malaria is the 9th leading cause of infant mortality worldwide. Malaria has a severe consequence in young infants because they don't have an immune response yet. And so most of the deaths reported, for example, 600,000, occur in infants under the age of 5, and the vast majority of them are in Africa. Now there's another cycle, a life cycle, and that's followed by Plasmodium vivax and ovale. And when the sporozoite from either of those two species invades the hepatocyte, they can choose to hibernate. So they'll form just a single organism on the inside of this cell. And then sometime later on, we don't know the trigger, but it could be weeks to months, sometimes years. The parasites within this cell will start to grow and form this schizont in the liver, which will start the infection again. So therefore, vivax and ovale can cause relapses. So when you have this cycle going on, we call it a relapse. A relapse infection due to parasites in the liver and not in the blood. And so we need a different drug to kill these organisms here. And so that's important for physicians to know because they have to prescribe a different drug. So the sporozoite enters, it goes through some sort of hibernation, and then at some time later it's going to break open. Now what this does is it allows Plasmodium vivax in particular to establish itself in very northern parts of the world. So if you might say, why do the northern parts of China have malaria? Well, it's because the people have these sporozoites in their liver, and they can go all through the winter without having any parasites in their blood. And then comes spring, one of these hypnozoites might, activate and start the infection again. And then when the mosquito density is high enough, then you'll get transmission. So these hibernating hypnozoite forms have allowed Plasmodium vivax to expand the geographical region that it can establish itself in. And so we have these two terms, recrudescence, which refers to parasites in the blood, and then your immune system, or maybe you take some drugs, drops it below the detectable threshold. And the person is usually asymptomatic at this time. And then something happens, the parasite starts to grow again, and now they have symptoms and they'll need drug treatment. So this reestablishment of infection due to parasites in the blood is called recrudescence. The reestablishment of infection due to hypnozoites is called relapse. So Plasmodium falciparum and vivax have recrudescence, Plasmodium ovale and vivax have relapses. Now, in order to understand the parasite cycle as well as diagnosis, you have to understand how the parasites grow inside the red blood cells. And they start off over here at the Merozoite first invaded. We call this a ring form, or some textbooks will call it a young trophozoite form. Has a red nucleus, a blue cytoplasm, and a clear vacuole. So it looks like a signet ring, so we call it a ring form. As the parasite starts to ingest and digest hemoglobin, it can't do anything with the iron, so the iron builds up in these waste vacuoles. And we see them as brown crystals inside the malaria parasite, and this is called hemozoin. The parasite will continue to grow inside the red blood cell, and eventually the nucleus will start to divide. And when the nucleus starts to divide, then we call these stages the schizon, or schizons. And eventually, at the very end, the last portion of development, we call it a segmenter, because the nucleus has pinched off around, the cytoplasm is pinched off around each nucleus, forming individual merozoites and leaving behind the remnants of the hemozoin, the waste vacuoles. So the appearance of hemozoin separates a ring form from a trophozoite. So as soon as you see hemozoin, you call it a trophozoite. The appearance of more than one nucleus separates a trophozoite from a schizont. So as soon as you see distinct nuclei, you can call it a schizont. And the formation of merozoite separates the schizont from a segmenter. Now, malaria has had an impact on human evolution. And one of the things that is noticeable is the selection for certain genes that allow humans to survive malaria infection. And the most famous one is the sickle cell hemoglobin. People that are heterozygous for sickle cell, that is, they have one normal hemoglobin gene and one sickle cell gene, are able to survive falciparum malaria at a slightly higher rate than those that have two normal hemoglobins or those that have two sickle cell hemoglobins. So over many thousands of years, a sickle cell gene has been selected for. But many other hemoglobin genes have been associated with that pressure from malaria parasites, so hemoglobin C, E, F, and the thalassemias, as well as some of the other altercations in the red blood cell, are a direct result of malaria infection in humans. Now, as far as the signs and symptoms goes, the patient will start off in a cold stage. Now, although they have a fever, they feel cold and they have a lot of shivering going on. So we're right over here in this cycle. And then that chills will turn into a fever. They feel extremely hot, dry, burning skin. They might have a throbbing headache, and we're getting up over here now in this fever cycle. And then they'll break into diffuse sweating, and their fever will start to decline and eventually come back to normal. Now, in between the fever peaks, the patient feels tired, but pretty much feels like they've gotten over the infection. But then it starts again. And these repeating fever patterns are what the Greeks first characterized, that you can, vivax, ovale, and somewhat falciparum, you'll have a fever peak and then 1 day's rest and then another episode of chills and fever. But malariae has 2 days in between, so the fever will go up and then you'll be fine for 2 days and then the fever will go back up. And that's really due to the development of the parasites within the red blood cell. So the merozoites are released. The merozoites enters a red blood cell and becomes a ring. Trophozoite, schizont, segmenter. When this segmenter bursts, releasing the hemozoin, the red cell fragments, parasite waste into the blood, then the fever goes up. And then as the spleen clears out all these waste products, the fever comes back down. And it's this repetitive fever going up and come down is in synchronous with the development of the parasite in the red blood cells. And so fever is an important characteristic of malaria infections. If it gets too high, the person is going to die, and usually malaria doesn't get this high, but it can get to 41 or 42 in severe cases, which, as you can see, just the fever alone, never mind that you have a severe anemia, can cause significant problems. For like Vivax and Malaria, you can get fevers as high as 104, which is still pretty high. Now, falciparum, I only want to point out, is the fever might stay high through that second day and not drop until the fever is going to go up again. And we'll talk about, at least Dr. Gosnell will talk about why that happens on Friday. And this is a consequence of all malaria infections, all three or all four species. So the parasite invades the red blood cell. It's using up the hemoglobin as food, forming hemoglobin as food, and forming hemozoin. This hemozoin can be broken down by the liver, but it takes a long time. So basically you have iron depletion leading to anemia. You have the lysed red blood cells, which of course is going to lead to anemia. And the high fevers and inflammation can lead to decreased erythropoiesis, which can lead to anemia. And then you can have an hyperactive spleen and a splenomegaly that will increase the destruction of even normal red blood cells. And we see this quite often, also leading to anemia. So there's multiple ways that anemia can manifest itself in humans. And so the cardinal kind of clinical manifestations of malaria are anemia, the high fever, which is due to the release of all those parasite antigens, and the splenomegaly, due to the spleen becoming hyperactive. It's retaining blood cells. It's part of the immune proliferation, and so it just gets enlarged. And this is just to re-emphasize how severe the malaria can be in children. So the bars are the mean hemoglobin concentration in these children in Gabon and in Africa. So they're already somewhat anemic anyways. And the line is the percentage of these children that actually have severe malaria. So we're talking about less than 5 grams per deciliter. And so you can see in these young children, under the age of 1, they have very severe anemia, which is the leading cause of death due to malaria, is the severe, causing almost half of all deaths is due to the severe anemia.